Today's hearing covers three items. The first I'll discuss is our emergency measure, the Continuing Appropriations and Border Security Enhancement Act. As members are aware, the United States faces many challenges today. The uncontrolled state of our southern border is certainly one of them. President Biden's self-inflicted border crisis continues to wreak havoc across the country. Another is the stark fiscal reality we face. Years of chronic overspending, particularly including the outrageous spending spree President Biden and congressional Democrats went on in 2021 and 22, has exacerbated an unsustainable trajectory. With a national debt of nearly $33 trillion, it's actually over $33 trillion now, our balance sheet needs to be addressed. The approaching deadline to pass funding bills to keep the government open and operating after September 30th, just 12 days from today, reiterates the work that needs to be done. Funding the government is core of our duties in Congress. The process is never easy, and in divided government, notably more difficult. Yet we must deliver on this priority and the other challenges before us if the United States is to continue to prosper now and into the future. To start, Congress can and must address the immediate problem before us. We have 2 weeks to avoid a shutdown. At the beginning of this Congress, House Republicans committed to the American people that we would change the way Washington does business on appropriations bills. No more would we be handed a 3,000-page appropriations bill the night before we would be voting on it. Instead, we committed to passing all 12 bills through regular order. Unfortunately, the appropriations process is deeply complex and it takes time. Sadly, we're running out of time to complete our work. But Congress ultimately has a responsibility to fund the government and keep it open and operating to provide needed services to our constituents. That's why the House is taking up the Continuing Appropriations and Border Security Enhancement Act. On the appropriations side, the bill will fund the government for another month to October 31st. That will give us additional time to work with our colleagues in the Senate who've yet to even pass one appropriations bill. But this bill also takes steps to address the other two challenges I mentioned. It sets an overall discretionary budget authority at $1.59 trillion in line with the Fiscal Responsibility Act, or FRA. It holds defense and veterans programs harmless, ensuring that we can both continue to defend the nation and care for those who've served. Other discretionary titles will see a reduction of 8% for the duration of the bill in compliance with the FRA. These fiscal reforms will help reduce the deficit and help offset the effects of President Biden and congressional Democrats' spending spree. The bill also includes border security measures to help gain operational control over the border and address the many serious security and humanitarian realities stemming from this crisis. Many of these measures build on the solutions House Republicans delivered as part of H.R. 2 earlier this year. I look forward to considering this measure, both here and in the Rules Committee and on the floor this week. We owe it to our constituents to address the crises the nation is facing. The Continuing Appropriations and Border Security Enhancement Act is a major step toward doing so. Our second item is H.R. 1130, the Unlocking Our Domestic LNG Potential Act of 2023. In the past 2 centuries, the United States has stood tall as one of the world's chief energy producers. In the early part of the 19th century, coal production was dominant and helped unleash America's industrial expansion. Oil drilling and production on a mass scale was invented in Pennsylvania in 1859, revolutionizing our growth trajectory. That spirit of homegrown energy and innovation continues today as natural gas leads the way. The United States is the top producer of natural gas in the world. In my home state of Oklahoma, we're proud to be part of that revolution. Oklahoma is the 5th largest natural gas producing state in the country, with nearly 350,000 jobs in the state tied to natural gas production. Natural gas is a critical part of Oklahoma's economy, as it is to the entire nation. But there's more to be done, and much of that is being left on the table. When the current House Republican majority took control of this chamber, we committed to unleashing America's energy potential. Today, we take a critical step as the House takes up H.R. 1130. This measure will streamline the permitting process for new liquid natural gas, or LNG, export and import facilities. All too often, proposed new LNG facilities are tied up for years in regulatory red tape. H.R. 1130 will make it easier, cheaper, and quicker to bring such new facilities online. The result is a strong future for our nation, one where we can export more natural gas to our friends and allies around the world, create more jobs at home, and ensure that the United States remains energy independent now and into the future. Finally, today's hearing also covers House Resolution 684, which condemns the governor of New Mexico for her attempt to subvert the Second Amendment and deprive the citizens of New Mexico of their right to bear arms. As members are aware, on September 8th, Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham issued an executive order that purported to take away the rights of New Mexicans to open or conceal carry firearms. The governor alleged this was necessary due to a public health emergency. Of course, that claim is absurd. There's no public health emergency exception to constitutional rights, and it's ridiculous to suggest otherwise. A constitutional right is just that, a right, and it cannot be subverted at the whim of an elected official. Last week, a federal judge in New Mexico agreed and issued a restraining order putting a stop to this unconstitutional action. Governor Grisham has rightly received condemnation on a bipartisan basis for her actions, and this week's members of the House will have the opportunity to do so officially. I urge all members to join in voting to condemn this unconstitutional and illegal attempt to suppress the Second Amendment rights of American citizens. I now yield to my good friend, our ranking member, Mr. McGovern, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have 2 weeks left before our government shuts down. A shutdown would hurt our nation's seniors, it would hurt our veterans, our families and children, it would hurt our workers, it would hurt all of our people. But instead of dealing with that, Republicans are stalling for time while trying to get their act together. So our first bill, H.R. 1130, is yet another giveaway to big oil and gas. Not content with the GOP passing the Polluters Over People Act, it seems the fossil fuel industry is on the phone once again asking for another handout, and my Republican friends are eager to oblige. This bill removes the requirement that natural gas exports be in the American public's interest, allowing adversaries and rivals like China to wreak havoc on our domestic energy supply. Now, I'm old enough to remember earlier this year when Republicans slammed President Biden because China was buying our oil. Now they want to make it easier to sell China our gas. You can't make this stuff up. Then we have H.Res. 684, a non-binding resolution condemning the governor of New Mexico. This resolution, as you all know, does nothing. It will not go to the Senate. It will not go to the president. It's a press release. More political grandstanding from a party that refuses to take action on gun violence. Republicans say no to background checks, no to closing bump stock loopholes, no to ensuring safe gun storage, no to banning lethal assault weapons. The gun violence crisis kills over 100 Americans every single day. And instead of taking steps to protect their constituents, it's clear Republican members would rather drag their feet and pass bills that do nothing to fix the problem. And, of course, we have a continuing resolution that was negotiated between the far right and the extreme far right of the Republican Party. No input from House Democrats, no input from Senate Democrats, hell, no input from Senate Republicans. Certainly nothing from the administration. I can't even tell if anyone from the Appropriations Committee was involved in this deal either. And we are still hearing several House GOP members refuse to support this bill. They say this doesn't go far enough, that, quote, it's a gift to Joe Biden. Are you kidding me? Keeping the government open isn't a gift to Joe Biden. It's our job on behalf of the American people. This CR also rams House Republicans' extreme H.R. 2 border bill down everybody's throats, a bill that already passed the House months ago and, by the way, is currently dying in the United States Senate. Now, if that were so important, you'd think their leadership would have talked about it more since then. Or maybe they would trying to negotiate a path forward in the Senate. But no. In fact, with the 8% funding cut to everything except for defense and veterans affairs, this bill actually decreases border security funding. I mean, to be honest, I still can't figure out if Republicans want stronger border security or not. Seems to me it's like more of a talking point than an actual plan. I can't stress this enough. This is all a waste of time. Every single one of my colleagues sitting on the other side of the dais knows this. They wasted half a month voting for Speaker, another month on gas stoves, another month on book bans, and now we're on the eve of a shutdown and doing nothing to stop it, all because there's a civil war going on in the Republican Party. So far, all I can discern is that the Republican plan to shut down the Republican plan is to shut down the government, impeach President Biden, and kick out their own Speaker. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Without objection, any prepared statements that our witnesses may have will be included in the record. I'd like to welcome our first panel, Representative Jeff Duncan and Representative Diana DeGette from the Committee on Energy and Commerce. Representative Duncan, welcome back to the Rules Committee, and I welcome your testimony.
Well, thank you, Chairman Cole and Ranking Member McGovern, for recognizing me to speak in support of H.R. 1130, unlocking our Domestic LNG Potential Act of 2023. This legislation was introduced by my good friend, Representative Bill Johnson, and it was considered through regular order in the Energy and Commerce Committee. H.R. 1130 will restore America's energy dominance and cement our position as a world-leading producer and exporter of natural gas. America is blessed with some of the largest reserves in energy in the world. We have the strongest environmental protections and the best workforce. We do energy production cleaner than anyone else in the world. We believe in free markets, innovation, and the rule of law. With all that going for us, we don't need to rely on OPEC or Russia or Venezuela or Iran for our energy needs. H.R. 1130 will ensure that our children and grandchildren do not have to beg dictators and autocrats for energy, as the Biden administration has done. H.R. 1130 will also give our allies in Europe a crucial lifeline, a safe and reliable supply of natural gas to wean themselves off of Russian gas. In December of 2015, Congress lifted the ban on crude oil exports on a bipartisan basis. Since we lifted the crude export ban, our energy production surged. Millions of jobs were preserved and created. New jobs were created in all 50 states. Our balance of trade improved. In 2019, we became a net exporter of petroleum for the first time since 1952. It's time that Congress lifts the regulatory restrictions that are shifting and stifling America's natural gas production. H.R. 1130 will create thousands of jobs here in the United States, encourage the expansion of clean American natural gas, and help reduce emissions globally by allowing our allies overseas to stop using dirty Russian fuel. H.R. 1130 contains strong protection to ensure that American natural gas will not go to state sponsors of terrorism or sanctioned countries like China. H.R. 1130 will advance U.S. global leadership and strengthen our economy. This bill is a win-win for the American people. I want to thank you for the opportunity to provide a statement here, and I encourage all my colleagues to join me in support of this legislation, and I'll be happy to answer any questions at that appropriate time, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I recognize my good friend, Ms. DeGette from Colorado. Welcome back, and you're recognized for your testimony.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the ranking member as well. Before I talk too much about why I oppose H.R. 1130 on the grounds of the bill itself, I want to talk for a minute about why we're all sitting here today. H.R. 1130 has already passed the House 2 times. Once as a part of H.R. 1, and the second time when it was included in H.R. 2811, both highly partisan bills that were dead on arrival in the Senate. Unfortunately, I fear this standalone version will suffer the same fate. So why do the Republicans keep bringing up this highly partisan bill? Because, frankly, they have nothing else to put on the floor. The government, as the ranking member said, the government is going to shut down on October 1st if we don't pass a stopgap continuing resolution, or as some of us might prefer, an omnibus bill that'll take us through the rest of this fiscal year. But the majority doesn't have the votes for that. They also don't have the votes, as the chairman pointed out, to pass any of the remaining 11 appropriations bills that have yet to advance through the House. So while the entire country and government is held hostage, waiting for the Republicans to make up their minds, it looks like that some of their greatest hits from earlier this Congress are going to come to the floor again. And I want to be clear, H.R. 1130 is emblematic of the bills that we've considered so far this Congress, and I am sad about that. This bill benefits China while making energy more expensive for Americans. It doubles down on a dependence on fossil fuels that benefits nobody except for big oil and gas. And it's a solution in search of a problem. If people wonder why LNG terminals aren't being built, they should wonder why facilities that have all of their permits, authorizations, and environmental reviews can't manage to finish construction and export more gas more than 7 years after they receive their authorizations from the Department of Energy. The bill eviscerates one of the few protections for consumers in the Natural Gas Act. Right now, anybody who wants to export LNG to a country that the U.S. doesn't have a free trade agreement with has to get approval from DOE, stating that the export is in the public interest. That's it. It's not an onerous requirement, but this bill completely removes that protection, meaning that the domestic natural gas market will become exactly like the domestic oil market, the Wild West. This would mean that the price of natural gas here in the U.S. would become more exposed to the decisions of the largest natural gas producers in the world besides us, Russia, Iran, and China. Now, anybody who's tired of Vladimir Putin and OPEC dictating the prices they pay at the pump should be terrified of the price manipulation making its way into their heating and into their electricity bills. That's exactly who this bill would benefit. It would especially benefit China. In 2021, China was the second biggest recipient of U.S. LNG. Earlier this year, Chinese LNG purchasers were snapping up any long-term deal they could find from American LNG exporters. And the reality is that increasing LNG exports does have an impact on domestic consumer costs. When we had our legislative hearing on this bill, which was well over 6 months ago, we heard from a witness who directly tied LNG exports to domestic natural gas prices that impact everybody. Last year, when an explosion knocked one of the biggest LNG export facilities in the U.S. offline, you immediately saw that natural gas prices fell by over 10%. Even last week, there was an article tying a 2% decrease in natural gas prices to an announcement that the facility would export slightly less than expected. I do want to flag for the committee, there were 2 amendments filed that would severely limit the worst consequences of this bill as currently written. The first would pause implementation of the bill's changes until DOE could certify that it would not increase natural gas prices. My amendment, the second one, would reinstate the public interest test for LNG exports to Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. I think these amendments would be vital to limiting the worst impacts of the bill, and I urge the Rules Committee to make both in order. As written, the bill would increase prices for consumers and potentially support Russia, China, and Iran. It's a lose-lose, and that's not even touching upon the greenhouse gas emission impacts of further doubling down on the fossil fuel infrastructure. The bill's not pro-American, it's not pro-consumer. It would just prop up the big oil and gas trading profits at the expense of everyday Americans. So I urge opposition to the bill, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'll withhold my questions for the moment. Gentleman from Texas, my good friend, the distinguished Vice Chairman of the Rules Committee, Dr. Burgess, recognized for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Chairman Cole. Thanks to our witnesses for being here. Chairman Duncan, if I recall correctly, when we had the legislative hearing on this and the issue was brought up about the gas plant in Texas going down, it was only a blip where the supply was interrupted. I mean, it was back online in a very short period of time, and in fact, over the long term, it did not affect prices at all. Do I recall that correctly?
I recall it the same way you do, yes, sir.
All right, well, let me just say, I was happy to vote for this in subcommittee. I was happy to vote for it in full committee. I'll be happy to vote for it again on the floor. The only missing piece I see is the pipeline permitting bill to help get the stranded gas from the Permian Basin to Freeport, Texas, so we can liquefy it and send it off as liquefied freedom to our allies and friends around the world. But thank you both for being here today.
Thank you. Chair recognizes my good friend, distinguished ranking member, for any questions he may have.
Yeah, let me just be brief. I want to thank the ranking member for her comments. We have done this before, as she's pointed out, not once but twice. The House has acted on this legislation. I expect that the fate of this bill will be the same fate of the previous efforts to move it forward, and that is nothing. Again, I would just say to my colleagues, you know, we ought to be seriously trying to figure out a way to avoid a government shutdown in 2 weeks, and this is not how you do it. But whatever. I mean, it's kind of pointless to ask questions, but it's great to see both of you, and I hope we don't see you again on this anytime soon. I yield back.
My good friend, gentlelady from Minnesota, is recognized for any questions she might have for the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just real quickly, Mr. Duncan, can you maybe talk about, you know, I really appreciate the fact that we're getting rid of or lessening regulations on anybody, because that's one of the things that concerns most people about government is the overregulation. And maybe you can talk about the opportunity cost of these regulatory reviews, and maybe talk about what's been left on the table, given that producers are, you know, have been tied up with this bureaucracy.
Well, it's no secret that the Biden administration from day one has had a war on fossil fuel production in this country. In fact, President Biden, as candidate Biden, talked about ending fracking and going after the fossil fuel industry. Just prior to that administration, we were a net exporter of crude oil around the world. We had a robust and growing energy sector. You know, we have to address production of the natural resources we have in this country. American-produced natural gas is cleaner burning than any other natural gas in the world, can be exported to help our allies in Europe lessen their dependence on Vladimir Putin's oligarch. We already see they're looking west to the U.S. to export that. We just can't export it fast enough for them, so they contract with Norway to build a pipeline in 1 year from Norway to Poland to deliver natural gas. Think about the expedited permitting process and that to go under the ocean to bring natural gas from Norway to Poland when we could provide it here if we can expedite the export terminals. But American-produced natural gas needs to be delivered. We have got to address, as Mr. Burgess said, pipeline permitting reform so we can deliver natural gas to where it can be utilized by our utilities here at home and can be exported to our friends and allies. If you want to approach this from a climate standpoint, just go read the Progressive Policy Institute's paper on the need to build out pipeline infrastructure and export terminals, because they could export natural gas to places like Vietnam, let them take their coal-fired power plants converted to natural gas and lower their carbon emissions, just like the United States has done. The reason we're a leader in the world in our carbon emissions is because of cleaner burning U.S.-produced natural gas. The Biden administration directed the DOE to push green energy initiatives at the detriment of fossil fuel production in this country. Our producers in the Marcellus and Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma and North Dakota can produce American resources, deliver those resources, lower energy costs for transportation, fuel, and utility production, and also help our friends and allies and others around the world that want to lower their carbon emissions as well by cleaner burning natural gas. But have to have a good regulatory environment that allows the industry to prosper.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate the fact that you are continuing to work to getting rid of unnecessary regulations, and I appreciate your efforts on this. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you. So as mentioned, this is the third time in as many months that the Rules Committee has convened purportedly to consider some legislation to fund the government. And based on reporting as we gavelled in, this week's effort is going to go the same way as the last two have, which is it won't pass. We won't even get the rule to the floor. And like the last two efforts, the committee now has to consider very minor bills that have already passed before, bills about bats and gas stoves, and now we've got a bill that has already passed the House twice, as I understand it. So I am forcibly reminded of the movie Groundhog Day, where poor Bill Murray has to repeat Groundhog Day over and over and over again until he learns to do better, because he does take the opportunity to learn from his mistakes over time. And rather than just repeating those mistakes, he becomes a better person, works with the people in the town where he is, and eventually has some success. So I would just, let's try to work on the end result of Groundhog Day. It'd be great if our colleagues across the aisle could come to the table and actually work with the rest of Congress and the Senate and the White House instead of perpetuating the same mistakes. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair thanks the gentlelady. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky. Gentleman has no questions. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado.
I thank the chairman, and thank you to the ranking member and the chairman or designees for purposes of today's hearing for your testimony. I just want to expound a bit and perhaps give you, Mr. Duncan, an opportunity to respond on the point that Ms. DeGette has raised, that Ms. Scanlon has raised, that the ranking member has raised, which is H.R. 1130 has passed the House twice. Is that right?
Portions of H.R. 30 were included in H.R. 1, I believe. I'm not sure about the second one, but
Let me just clarify.
I'll go with it, yes.
My understanding is
We'll
that
go with it, yeah.
the bill in its entirety, and maybe someone can clarify if that's not the case, and I know you have staff here that are with you, passed as part of H.R. 1 earlier this year, and passed as part of, a portion of it passed as part of the Limit, Save, Grow Act. So on two separate occasions, this committee has considered this bill. The House has considered this bill. It has passed the House. Why are we here? What are we doing? Why are you back in front of this committee, asking this committee to consider this bill for the third time when government funding runs out in 7 legislative days?
Well, it shows the importance of addressing the energy sector in this nation, because the Biden administration's war started on day one, and his administration, his war on American energy production has cost consumers. It's cost them at the pump, has cost them through inflationary prices, because there's trickle down from transportation fuels all the way down to what you buy at the grocery store.
To your
and
end.
so this shows that this is important to the Republican majority to actually jumpstart the American energy
If that's the
sector
case,
once
Mr.
again.
Duncan, if that's the case, why hasn't the House, why hasn't the Republican majority sent H.R. 1 to the Senate? H.R. 1 is sitting at the desk downstairs. House Republicans refuse to send it to the United States Senate so that it can consider the bill that you apparently believe is the most important priority of the House Republican caucus. Why haven't they done that?
I'd have to check with the speaker on that.
Is your plan to come back here next week again with this bill after the House has passed
I'd be
it?
fine with that.
This is
I'd be
how
fine
the
with
House
bringing
Republican-
H.R. 1 back up. I'd be fine with bringing energy bills we've already passed or future energy bills back to this Rules Committee,
Duncan.
back to the House floor, and pass them out and
What
show
is
the
the-
American
what is the
people what
point of
we believe
passing
about
bills?
American energy production.
What is the point of passing bills and then not sending them to the Senate so that they can actually get enacted into law? I don't
That's a
understand.
question for Speaker McCarthy and
Well, I hope he answers it, because I'm trying to understand why the House Republican caucus. Look, I get it. I understand. You are very passionate about this bill. Everyone can tell. That's evidenced by the fact that you passed it back in March and then passed it again back in May. The lunacy of continually coming back to this committee and asking us to consider a bill that you've already passed. You did it. Why are you here again? I mean, why not consider other bills, perhaps maybe a bill to fund the government? That might be something that comes within the jurisdiction of this committee and would be prudent for this committee to consider
Sorry, we
doing
feel you're
in
wasting-
light of
we're
the
wasting
government
your
funding
time,
shutdown.
but,
So,
I
Ms.
don't
DeGette,
see it's good.
it sounds like you might have.
Well, I just wanted to, Mr. Neguse, I just wanted to correct the record because my colleague and friend, the chairman of the subcommittee, said that U.S. oil production has been suffering under the Biden administration. I myself, and I think most of the Democrats here, think we should move to clean renewable energy, but CNN reports that U.S. oil production has, quote, shattered all-time records under Biden with more production than the Trump administration, and it's projected to be 12.8 million barrels a day. But what this bill does, this bill doesn't really have anything at all to do with oil production. And it also doesn't really have anything at all to do with natural gas production. What this bill does is it amends the Natural Gas Act to remove the requirement that DOE conduct a public interest review if we're going to export natural gas to countries that the U.S. doesn't have a free trade agreement with, like China and countries like that. And so what this bill would actually do is it would harm the consumer in the U.S. because it would eliminate that public interest requirement. And that's why the bill didn't go anywhere the 2 times that it went to the Senate, and why it wouldn't make any changes if it went to the Senate this time.
Well, I couldn't agree more, Ms. DeGette, and I'm glad you made that point, because I read with great interest the background in terms of the committee proceedings that you all had, and Mr. Chairman, that you held with respect to this bill, and the amendment that Ms. DeGette proposed that I thought was a pretty reasonable amendment. I was quite surprised to read that Republicans had rejected it. The amendment, as I understand it, and Ms. DeGette can clarify if I'm misconstruing this, simply altered the bill to limit or prevent exports of liquid natural gas to the People's Republic of China, North Korea, Russia, or Iran. That's it. And that amendment was defeated in your, not in the subcommittee, I should say, the full committee, is my understanding. Care to respond to that, or maybe explain why why you all
Well, both
rejected
this
that amendment?
administration, last administration, already has sanctions against those countries that prohibit that. There was no need for legislative action.
So explain that to me, because I read the technical language in the bill, the statutory language of the bill. It makes very clear that any state that has been designated a state sponsor of terrorism by the Secretary of State pursuant to a variety of laws that we've enacted in the Congress, that those countries are still banned from potentially accepting or rather transacting with respect to LNG and the United States exports of them. China is not on that list,
Are they a
on the
state
Secretary
sponsor
of
of terror?
State's list. What was that?
Are they a state sponsor of terrorism?
I am saying to you, they have not been designated as such by the Secretary of State. That's precisely why Ms. DeGette proposed an amendment to ban the export to China. And I'm trying to understand why Republicans opposed it.
Well, there's already sanctions in place by the administration and the last administration, probably previous administrations prior to the Trump administration, that bans that. The whole point is to remove regulations on the exportation and importation of natural gas to assure Americans can realize the benefits of increased production here and supply. We've got allies in Europe that are begging for U.S. to produce natural gas, more export.
This amendment doesn't address them. That's what I'm saying, Mr. Duncan. I understand your
Look, like I
passion for it.
said, there are already sanctions in place.
I've read the statutory language does not. China is not subsumed by that language. That's why Ms. DeGette introduced the amendment. And so, and maybe we can get some clarification from. This is a question made in good faith. The point is, I suspect that you share my belief that China shouldn't be receiving these exports, right? So if that's the case, let's find a way to ensure that this bill actually achieves that outcome, because that's not.
China's one of the largest economies. Asia's got one of the fastest growing economy areas in the world, right? China's building a new coal-fired power plant every 30 days for generation. Would you not also believe that if they would import American-produced, cleaner-burning natural gas and not build coal-fired power plants, it would be better for the environment?
So that is an honest answer. That's what I was hoping you would say, because at least you can concede, yes, the bill allows.
China,
Hold on, Mr.
Vietnam.
Duncan,
No, I didn't. I said
let me
that
finish my statement.
the administration already has
Mr. Duncan,
sanctions in place.
Let me finish my statement, and then I'll give you a chance to respond. That's the point. I'd like to have an intellectual exchange in which you can make the argument on the merits, as you've done, as to why you believe that exports should go to China. That's your prerogative to make that argument. Ms. DeGette made an argument that they should not, and she proposed that in the bulk of an amendment. That amendment was rejected by your majority on the Energy and Commerce Committee. I don't think that reflects the majority view of the American people. I think most folks would agree with Ms. DeGette and myself that exports should not be going to those 4 countries. But again, you're entitled to that view. I would just simply say, to the extent that this bill is being argued as somehow being to the benefit of consumers, it's bellied by the fact that the organizations who are lobbying the Congress on this particular bill are not consumer organizations. For those who might be tuning into the Rules Committee, they can Google it, they can go on Open Secrets, they can see a list of the various entities and special interest organizations that are lobbying on this bill. I can assure you they are not consumer organizations. I took a list you want to, gather to perhaps make a guess as to the type of organizations that are lobbying on this bill? There were 12 that I found.
I haven't been lobbied on the bill, so
Well, I'm glad to hear that, but I will just tell you, the groups that have filed public disclosures indicating that they are lobbying on this bill include Enbridge Incorporated. It's a Canadian multinational pipeline and energy company headquartered in Calgary, the Independent Petroleum Association of America, ConocoPhillips, the American Exploration and Production Council. List goes on and on. There's a reason that these companies
Where does
are,
Burisma stand?
I didn't see them on Open Secrets, but I don't know if they're in support of the bill. If Mr. Massey, I take it Mr. Massey's going to vote for this bill, so I'm not so sure that that question is in his favor. But in any event, I'll give him an opportunity to answer that if he'd like. Bottom line, the point being, the definition of an insanity is to keep doing the same thing over and over and expect a different outcome. And Energy and Commerce Committee, my understanding, I'm not on the committee. I understand it's a very important committee with jurisdiction that extends across our country, and I don't understand why the committee is before this committee yet again asking us to consider a bill that we've already considered twice, and notwithstanding all the other issues that we're dealing with as a Congress and as a country. But as I said, the Republicans, you have control over the calendar. You have control over whether bills get sent to the Senate or not after the House has passed them. And so I suppose we can keep doing this charade where a committee submits a bill that we've already considered, and this committee moves it to the floor, and the House considers it yet again, and then sits on it and doesn't send it to the Senate because they have no actual intention of wanting the United States Senate to even debate the bill. That doesn't seem like the most effective way to run the government. But with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
Thank you very much. Chairwood always appreciates robust debate. We just remind everybody, both sides out, please try not to speak over one another during the debate, just for the sake of our stenographer. So with that, I'd recognize my good friend from South Carolina for any questions he might have.
I appreciate Mr. Neguse, taking, my watch.
Neguse.
Oh, I'm from Mr. Neguse, I'm sorry. Last 15 minutes for a bill that you say is just
Singular, not plural.
It's just useless, taking up this kind of time for a useless bill. But I also find it kind of interesting that my good friends on the opposite side criticize American company as being, I guess, raping the American public. If you look at where the prices have been, gas prices, utility prices, energy prices spiked 29.3% in 2021, further 7.3% in 2022. Gasoline prices have spiked 49.5% in 21. The American people are feeling the effects of this Biden administration and what they're doing to our energy supplies in this country. It's a war on the American people. And energy everyone has to have. And I find it's interesting that we criticize American companies. I know on the previous administration, Trump administration, these were a fraction of the cost of what these increases were, because we're buying it. This administration is buying energy from countries that don't like us. Now, if you like Iran, who this administration just gave $6 billion to, I guess, the foreign countries are who this administration likes and will pay hard-earned money that we're having to borrow to support. You also hear China, he's trying to, there's efforts on the Chinese economy, which is suffering. This administration, they say yes to China, including flying a balloon over for a week or more. How does that work? But, Councilman Duncan, you don't have to explain why this bill comes up. You keep, there's a lot of bills that come before Congress. You've been in here longer than I have. But there are a lot of bills that come up that stagnant for whatever reason, but you don't quit on them. People are sick of government. They're sick on the rulings, and they're sick on America sitting on the energy supplies and then just hamstringing them. And while China is running rampant on, as you say, building coal-powered plants that I don't think are helping the environment. So I applaud you for doing it. We'll see if we can move it on and plan to vote for it. Appreciate you bringing it up. Yield back.
Thank you. I recognize my good friend, oh, she's not, she's left, so Chair would now recognize my friend from the great state of Texas for any questions he might have for the panel.
Thank the chairman. I think it's a quick question to a friend from South Carolina with respect to prices. My other friend from South Carolina was just talking about. Could you speak a little bit to, we've heard a lot about, record high production in oil and so forth. Talk a little bit about prices, price impact, what's going on, with respect to gas, oil, because of the constraints of this administration and my Democratic colleagues.
Yeah, so from day one, the Biden administration had a war on American energy production. They were very clear on the campaign trail they were going to do that. They ended production on federal land, offshore federal areas in the OCS. They continue to use the Department of Energy and regulations to push green initiatives at the detriment to oil and gas producers, refiners, through regulatory environment. What we're trying to do is increase production in this country, increase delivery in this country through pipeline permitting reform and a build out of an infrastructure that's needed vastly. Utilize those resources to lower energy prices for Americans by the power companies, and then export cleaner burning U.S. produced natural gas to lower carbon emissions, but help our friends and allies in places like Europe that are relying on Russia and having to look west and look at other sources for energy. Allow more production at home, create jobs. I think the estimate of jobs that would be created here through increased energy production is somewhere between 220,000 and 453,000 American jobs by 2040. This LNG exports could add between $50 and $73 billion U.S. economy. Produce it here, keep the money here, keep the jobs here, and help lower global carbon emissions by allowing folks like Vietnam or China or anywhere else that wants to buy natural gas on a global market to lower their carbon emissions. India, I can go through a whole litany of countries that we could export gas to help lower their carbon emissions, while also sending it to places like Africa where they can raise their standard of living, actually heat and cool their homes and cook food over cleaner burning U.S. produced natural gas. It just works to produce natural gas and oil here in this country, be able to export it to help our friends and allies around the world, keep the money, keep the jobs here, and grow the U.S. economy. There is no national security without energy security, and we can do it through supporting a good export market. I yield back.
Energy prices have increased by 39% since Biden took office. Does that sound right to you? Gasoline up 53%, gas now $3.83 a gallon, electricity up 26%. Data I have says the United States could increase gas production 50% and LNG exports fourfold over the next decade if allowed to carry out its market potential.
That's correct.
We talked about China earlier. Better or worse to make China dependent on American natural gas? I mean, putting aside whatever you want to say about it, which would be better for our national security and for the world to make, would it be better or worse if China were to be dependent on the United States American natural gas, particularly considering that China has 1,100 or so, give or take, coal-fired plants that are producing, 2 a week, and we have about 250 or so and are producing none. What would you think? Better for us, better for the world if we had more liquefied natural gas going out and gas production and China consuming it, or no?
Better for us and better for the world. Lower carbon emissions. And what's ironic about the power plants they're building, the coal-fired power plants they're building, they're utilizing to produce electricity, to produce the solar panels and the wind turbines and other things that they turn around and sell back to us as we push to lower the American standard of living by increasing more renewables.
Last week we had a witness, a Democratic witness, who couldn't answer the question about the fact that batteries for cars, in particular for EVs, that the cobalt that's mined to produce those batteries is heavily mined by slave labor and often child labor. Do you find that to be a particularly abhorrent practice, and that it might be better to live and produce live off of and produce American energy?
I agree with you. And in the mining aspect and the energy aspect, nobody does it cleaner and better and more environmentally sensitive than the United States of America. China's using child labor and raping the environment in places like Africa where they mine these critical minerals for the EVs.
If we had vastly expanded our ability to export natural gas earlier and weren't constrained by this administration, European dependence on Russia for energy would be reduced, correct?
That's correct.
Gas accounts for about 20% of the EU's power generation, and I believe Russia accounted for about 40% of EU gas consumption. In 2020, Russian gas accounted for 48% of Europe's natural gas imports. Is it better for our national security? Is it better for us to export liquefied natural gas in order to, I don't know, stick it to Russia?
That sounds correct.
In 2021, the U.S. became the top LNG exporter to the EU, accounting for 26% of total. However, pipeline gas made up 74% of EU gas imports. Are the current Democrat administration policies hampering our ability to compete and export LNG on the world stage?
They are.
Does that increase or diminish our national security?
Diminishes our national security.
Does that help or hurt, say, Russia and some of our competitors?
It supports Vladimir Putin's oligarch and puts money in the pocket to fund the war in Ukraine.
Overall, I would just suggest on the point about H.R. 1 and having another bill, it's hardly something new in this institution when we have a larger package that we break off an individual component of it and move it in isolation because of its critical import for the well-being of this country. Not because it's for some particular industry per se. I would ask my colleague one final question. The Inflation Reduction Act, talk about the benefit for a specific industry. Do 90% of the subsidies go to billion-dollar corporations of the big corporate subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act?
Generally in the green initiatives, yes.
Yeah, and are the lion's share of the subsidies for EVs and so forth going to families that make up to multi-$100,000 a year in order to use those subsidies?
Sounds correct.
Yeah, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Is there any additional questions? Seeing none, our panel's excused.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We'll see you again next week.